So now that we've got our app, which currently has a single button to be able to play a single sound, namely note 1, how can we have lots of buttons, more specifically 7 buttons, so that each of them plays a different sound? As a challenge, I want you to build 7 buttons on the screen, and they should play the sound from note 1 through to note 7. Once you're done, this is what you should have. You should have 7 buttons, each with a different color so you can tell them apart. And going from the top to the bottom, when you click on them, you should hear a different sound. So 7 sounds, 7 buttons, each having a different color. Don't worry too much about the layout for now. We're going to stretch it out a little bit later on, but for now, let's just concentrate on the functionality. So pause the video and try to complete this challenge. All right, so there shouldn't be anything too difficult here, but we do have to write quite a bit of code. First things first, I'm going to get rid of our center widget, and I'm going to do that by holding down Option or Alt, hitting Enter, and remove widget. Now instead, I want my flat button to be inside a column. So I'm going to wrap it with a column. Now I have a column with a single flat button, which simply has the text that says click me, which I don't really need anymore. So I'm going to delete that. But what I do want is I want our flat button to have a color. So I'm going to give it a red color to begin with. So this is going to be our first button. And now that I'm done with that flat button, I'm going to copy it. And for time's sake, I'm going to paste it in here 6 times. So we should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 buttons. And now we're going to go through this and update each of them. So we're going to change the colors. So they each have a different color. And I'm just going to go down the rainbow. If you are more creative, then feel free to pick your color palette. All right, so that's done for all of our buttons. And now if we hit save and just check out the result to see if it looks, yep, it looks pretty much like what we saw in the demo. We've got 7 buttons, each with a different color. Now, flat buttons by default come with a width and a height, but we don't have to worry about that too much for now. We're just going to focus on making it play different sounds, because at the moment they all play note 1. And that is, of course, we're telling it to play note 1. Remember that the player is kind of like a CD player, right? And the part that we're putting here is the CD. We're telling it what to play. So we want our first button to play note 1, the second to play note 2, 3, 4, and so on. So now that we've updated all of our file names, telling each button to play a different sound, let's hit save and let's see if that worked. Perfect. So that should have been pretty simple. But you can see that our code isn't very pretty because there's a lot of repeated code in here, right? How can we get rid of the parts that are repeated so that we have less code on our screen, which means less things to go wrong and less places to look for bugs? Well, we're going to build a function. Remembering how we built functions in the Dicey module, we started with the void keyword, and then we gave our function a name. So let's call this one playSound. And inside this function, we're going to transplant our 2 lines of repeated code. And I'm going to simply cut it out from our onPressed for our flat button, and I'm going to paste it here to move that functionality over. And then instead of having to type out 2 lines of code here, I'm simply going to call playSound. And let's go ahead and do the same for all the other places. I'm going to copy this function playSound, and I'm going to replace all the places where I need that functionality, namely creating a new audio player and playing a sound with this new function that I just created. Now, some of you are already realizing that there's a bit of a problem because we wanted each of the buttons to play a different sound and not for all of them to play the same sound, note 1. In Dicey, the only type of function that we learned about was the most basic type of function, and it looks like this. It simply has a name, and it allows you to reduce repeated code by bundling code together into a block of code and giving that entire block of code a name to refer to. So that means when it's needed, then you can call the function by its name and it will search out where that function was created to execute all the lines of code inside the curly braces of that block of code. Now, we're coming up against a bit of a problem here because I want this button to play note 1 and this one to play note 2 and 3 and 4 and so on and so forth. So we actually need these 2 lines of code, but we need one thing to be different about them. We need this to be either 1 or 2 or 3. So how can we do this? Well, this is where input arguments to functions come in handy, because we can simply specify in these parentheses or round braces, which we've never used before. We've always kept it empty. We kept it empty when we called it, and we kept it empty when we created it. But now is their moment to shine. Inside the parentheses, we can specify that this function requires an input. And we specify the data type that the input has to be. So in this case, if we're going from note 1 to note 7, then that input has to be an integer, right? It has to be a whole number, either 1 or 3 or 7, and whatever it is that we need to replace this particular number. Now, in addition to the data type, we have to give it a name because we can have multiple inputs and we need to be able to refer to it inside the function. So let's give this one a name of sound number. It's the note number that we want to play. Now, this is completely arbitrary. You can call it anything you want here, but this is what makes sense to me in this moment. So right now, inside this function, we now have access to that input, whatever it may be in the future. And we're going to say that instead of hard coding the file name that we're going to tell our player to play, we're going to instead replace it with a $sign and the name of that input. So now, depending on what we pass in here, it will be replaced inside here and will play the sound that we specified in the input. So now you can see we've got some red squiggly lines around here because it's saying there's actually an input or an argument that's expected, but 0 found. So let's provide that argument. Let's put 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. Okay, so now let's hit save. And we have exactly the same functionality as before. Our sound files are all different that's being played, but we've reduced the number of lines of code dramatically by using a function to group together the functionality that's repeatedly used in our code. In the next lesson, for those of you guys who are new to programming and you want to learn about how these functions with inputs work in more detail, that's what I'm going to cover. Now, if you're an experienced programmer and you want to skip ahead to learn more about Flutter development, then feel free to skip that lesson and continue to the next one. So make your choices, and I'll see you on your next lesson.